Welcome, everybody, to another edition of E.W. Jackson for America. Well, I'm excited this morning. Lots of stuff to talk about. I hope that it's already going well for you this Tuesday morning. I don't know how many of you actually had off yesterday. I know the federal government does, but a lot of people in the private sector are working on the Martin Luther King holiday. My church sponsors a big Martin Luther King what we call the Martin Luther King Leadership Breakfast in Chesapeake, Virginia, on the Monday holiday. We had it yesterday, had almost 300 people there. I mean, it was just a wonderful event. I'll get into that in a second because that's what I want to talk about today. We're talking about the whole issue of race. I didn't do this before. I said I'll wait until after. So I'm going to do that today. But first, congratulations to former President Donald Trump, who won a landslide victory for the Iowa caucuses yesterday in sub-zero degree temperatures, terrible weather, difficult weather, and yet overwhelmingly won. I think DeSantis came in with, what was it, 19%, Nikki Haley 17%, Vivek Ramaswamy in single digits. I didn't catch all of this because at that point I was sort of moving, getting ready to come in and talk to you, but I believe Vivek Ramaswamy has dropped out and endorsed former President Donald Trump. I am frankly pleased with the outcome. I wish I could have been a part of the Iowa caucuses, but I simply didn't have the resources to continue at that point. We'll see what the future holds. But I'm pleased with the outcome because, as I've said before, Donald Trump and Rick DeSantis, as far as I'm concerned, are the only two candidates in the race that are worthy of any consideration whatsoever. Any consideration whatsoever. Vivek Ramaswamy, I wrote him off a long time ago. Wouldn't vote for him. I can't imagine any circumstance in which I would vote for Vivek Ramaswamy. Not a single one. And I think the same is pretty much true for Nikki Haley. I mean, she is maybe not quite as bad, but so close that I'm hard-pressed to make a real distinction. As far as I'm concerned, both of them just need to move on. There's no way either of them should get anywhere near the White House. And I tell you, the notion of I don't believe he would do it, of President Trump choosing either of them for running mate, that to me would be an unmitigated disaster. It would throw into question whether I could vote for him. I mean, in electoral politics. But after that event is over, I'm then at that point going to endorse, and I'll explain why I'm endorsing. And so, basically there's only two potential choices at stake here. So, it's going to be one of the two of them. But until and unless I make the announcement, I'm not making any official declaration as to who I'm going to support or who I'm going to endorse. I have friends who are supporting Rick DeSantis. I have friends who are supporting Donald Trump. I will be led by the Spirit of God and the very best wisdom I can touch regarding the future of our country. And I've shared a little bit of that with you. And by the way, when I endorse, I'm also going to explain my position on the Republican Party, what I see my future in the Republican Party as, and where I see Christians with regard to the Republican Party, because I've got some serious misgivings about the treatment of Christians in the Republican Party. Very, very serious misgivings. But anyway, let me not get into that. I wanted to congratulate President Trump, and so we'll now see what the future holds. Vivek Ramaswamy is finally out, I guess, in spite of Fox trying to make him the darling Hindu of the nation. They didn't manage to get him nominated. I don't know what the deal is, whether a bunch of closet Hindus at Fox, I don't know what the deal is, but I tell you, they were pushing him hard. I mean, they were pushing him hard from the very beginning. Maybe he seeded a little money around. I don't know what the deal was, but I mean, my goodness, every time you look up, it's Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, even some Christian organizations were pushing him, which, again, I didn't quite understand that. I mean, some Christian organizations that I'm familiar with, involved with, would seem to be I'm thinking to myself, why are you putting a Hindu up? Like, I mean, what is wrong with you? Well, again, I don't want to get off into that. That'll take up too much time. I'm going to come back to it, though. I'll be touching on it, of course, again and again, but I'll come back and explain fully mine. In fact, you know what? I'll tell you what. I'll tell you exactly now when I'm going to announce my endorsement. I'm going to announce my endorsement on January the 30th. January the 30th, I will reveal who I'm endorsing and why. On January the 30th, okay? I will reveal who I am endorsing and why. But again, now let me come back to what I wanted to discuss with you all today. And welcome, by the way, our Instagram audience too, because of course you all are watching online. Instagram is watching directly through my cell phone. They've got a slightly different perspective because right now we're not able to access them through our regular live stream system. We'll work on that so that all of you can see me right through our studio camera. Let me begin to talk about this way. My church has a prayer conference call every morning without fail. I mean, holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, every Sundays, every day, okay? The only day we don't have the conference call is when we do the Martin Luther King Leadership Breakfast, because so many of my church members are heading to the hotel early to get everything set up and put everything in place. And so we pray there instead of praying online. But today, I had one of my church members who was on the prayer line say to me, Bishop, I had some relatives there, and one of them, a young lady, said she wants to talk to you. And I said, okay, about what? She wants to show you where you're wrong when you talk about these issues of race. And I thought, that's exactly what I need. Is, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old to explain to me where I'm wrong on the issues of race, because they know so very much, right? And this young person apparently happens to be a Christian, and we got to discussing, and I said, well, you know what the problem is? The problem is this person does not have a biblical worldview. They've got a racial worldview. Now, let me say this to all you Christians watching me right now, some of whom are Americans of African ancestry, some of whom are Americans of European ancestry, some of you may be of other ancestry, Hispanic, what have you, Asian. You can't have dual worldviews dominating your life. Jesus said no man can serve two masters. Either he will love the one and hate the other, or he will cling to the one and despise the other. You can't have a Christian and biblical worldview, but also have a racial worldview. You've got one or the other. And the sad reality is that there are many people who are Christians, or who think they are Christians, who do not have a biblical worldview. They have a racial worldview. They see the world through the lens of race. And now this is something of a little bit of a caricature, but it's essentially correct. All black people are victims of white people, according to this racial worldview. All black people are victims of white people. All white people are racists or white supremacists or what have you, even if they don't know it. In fact, if they don't know it, that makes them worse, because then they are perpetrators of implied bias and microaggressions and systemic racism. But they are all racists, whether they know it or not. Because after all, according to the homosexual, gender-confused Ibram Kendi, this idiot up there at BU that they're paying who knows how much money to spew this stupid nonsense. If you are not anti-racist as he would define it, which means you're reading his stupid books and promoting his stupid demagogic rhetoric, if you're not anti-racist, then you are by definition racist. So that's the general perspective. All black people. Oh, and by the way, let me not leave this part out. This is important. All black people are not only victims, all black people are virtuous victims. Because by virtue of being black, or by dint of being black, you are, by definition, virtuous. You being a victim of white people makes you virtuous. And all white people are villains. Even the ones who want to be nice, even the ones who think they're nice, they are all villains. So you've got all people of color, whatever that means, because I've never met a person who didn't have color, are virtuous victims. And all white people are oppressive villains. Now that's the racial perspective. That's the perspective that is being pushed in by the NAACP, by the Urban League, by many black churches, and by the left in general, regardless of the color of their skin. That's the perspective. That's the worldview being pushed. I don't buy that worldview. I don't accept that worldview. I have a biblical worldview. And a biblical worldview says what? There is none righteous, no, not one. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So there's no white people are oppressive villains, black people are virtuous victims. That's a lot of nonsense. That's one great big old wagon full of horse manure. It's just not true. Well, you know, black people can't be racist because you have to have power to be. They just gotta make this stuff up out of whole cloth. Ask the white person murdered by some black person out of racial animus whether the black person who murdered him was racist. There was a 5-year-old boy, I believe his name was Conant, murdered by this black guy who walked out of a trailer and shot the 5-year-old white boy in the head for nothing other than the fact that he's white. Was the black guy racist? Oh, no, he can't be racist because you have to have power to be. I mean, but that's the racial worldview. See, the biblical worldview says all sin against other human beings comes out of the human heart. It has nothing to do with whether you have power or not. It has to do with the condition of the human heart. And of course, the Bible says that the heart is sinfully wicked above everything. Who can know it? And there's only one antidote to it, and his name is Jesus Christ. He's the only one who has the cure for the human heart. Now, let me show why the racial worldview is so wrong and the biblical worldview is so right. See, the racial worldview does not explain at all of the oppression and all the conflict and all the conquest and all of the killings of people within their own demographic and geographical group. And so, for example, as I've explained many times, slavery was practiced in China and they enslaved other Chinese. Slavery was practiced in Europe and they enslaved other Europeans. I've often kind of tongue-in-cheek say, I mean, didn't anybody see Spartacus? You know? Because Spartacus was the European Romans oppressing the European Greeks and making them their slaves, or Spartans making them their slaves. And of course, Spartacus led a revolt, an uprising. And we know the famous crucifixions along the Appian Way where they just crucified slaves. I mean, that's a historical fact. And there was no racial difference between these people because it wasn't race that mattered. It was these people are subjugated to us and we're going to do whatever we need to do in order to keep it that way. Africans subjugated, oppressed, enslaved, committed genocidal acts against other Africans, whether it was based upon tribal differences or the early nation states of Africa. You know, the empire of Songhai, I think it's pronounced, or what have you. But there were kings in Africa who had thousands of slaves. The North African Muslims pioneered the sub-Saharan slave trade. In fact, they have a word, abid, which means both African or black and slave. Because they were the first really to develop racial ideology that said dark-skinned Africans make good slaves. It was not Europeans that did that, it was Africans that did that. And I could go on explaining this, but every continent, every people has experienced and practiced slavery. In fact, I was just reading in Exodus a few days ago, the rules God gave people about the treatment of slaves. And of course, people read that and say, see, the Bible is racist because the Bible justifies slavery. No, just like with divorce, God simply gave people rules for dealing with what was existing on the earth. I say, how in the world can God be in favor of slavery when the whole, the epic story that opens the Bible is the story of the Exodus, where God delivers his people out of slavery? How in the world can God be in favor of slavery? The Bible doesn't say, oh, you know, slavery was really good for the Jews. God left them there because he thought that was really a great way for them to live and a way for them to experience the best. No, he brought them out. In fact, it was the Israelites who often, when they faced hardship, wanted to go back because they had spent enough time in Egypt that they had a slave mentality. And they were constantly looking back. Sound familiar? They were constantly looking back. That's why God had to allow that generation to die out and raise up a new generation, didn't know anything about Egypt or slavery, so that they could go into the promised land that he had for them. Because the Jews that he brought out of Israel, except for Caleb and Joshua, all had a backward perspective. My point is, when you look at the whole of human history, when you look at it through a biblical lens, you see the problem is not the skin, but the sin. We've got human trafficking going on right now. We call it human trafficking, but it's nothing but slavery. I mean, it's slavery. Where you kidnap people or you buy people, and those people become servants or sex slaves or whatever to whoever the owner is. It's slavery. It's happening today. And in Muslim countries, they're still practicing slavery on the QT. And Boko Haram and some of these other radical Islamic organizations are in fact capturing and enslaving Africans, particularly in Nigeria right now, and enslaving Africans, either killing them or enslaving them. And there are countries around the world right now that still practice slavery, even though they, like as I've said, they've tried to hide it because it has become so abhorrent now to most people that they try to hide it, but they're still doing it. Because the problem is not race, the problem is the sinful condition of the human heart. Well, I expressed some of that yesterday. I didn't get really deep into that, but let me add one other thing before I move on to sort of the second part of this that I want to discuss. One of the most evil and pernicious and dangerous ideas that the left is trying to sell, particularly to black people, but to America in general, is that all our problems are the fault of white men. White men are the issue. You know, you can't say anything. You can have some, I mean, you've got people who will defend pedophiles now. Well, let's call them MAPS, minor attracted persons. I mean, you've got these leftists who will justify pedophilia now. They're so sick and so disgustingly perverse. So even that they'll defend. But I tell you what, There are two groups right now. Well, maybe I would add a third, which is the Jewish people, given this rising anti-Semitism that we're seeing. But the two I was going to mention first, two groups right now that it is perfectly okay to disparage are white people, particularly white men first and foremost, white women too, because after all white women are Karens, right? And then third, Christians. Christians. Oh, there's some really bad people. I just read an article this morning about the FBI investigating conservative Christians, conservative Catholics who want to practice the Latin Mass, who are very serious about their faith. Those people are dangerous. Those people are extremists. So if you're white, particularly a white male, that's the worst. Not far behind him is the white woman, the Karen. If you are a Christian, because after all, Christianity is nothing but a white man's ploy to oppress people, right? Of course, when you get me and millions of others, people from various parts of the world here in our country, people of various backgrounds, ethnicities, complexions, and then around the world, people of various backgrounds, all saying, we proclaim the name of Jesus Christ, and we are followers of Jesus Christ, and we are children of the living God. And then you become lumped in with those bad white people because you bought into their white religion, which is intended to do nothing but to oppress people of color. This is one of the most dangerous ideological poisons to ever enter the cultural bloodstream of a people, because let me tell you what it's akin to. It is just like Hitler telling the German people that all of their problems are the result of Jews. It is the same thing. It is the same thing. And it's evil. It's wicked. It's sick. Let me just give you an example that you may find a little bit off base, but you'll get my point when I share it. Do you know that the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States of America is a black man by the name of Sam Little? Sam Little is, I think, by all FBI accounts and all criminal justice accounts, the most prolific serial killer in the history of our country. And he killed women all over the nation, all over. What's your point? My point is simply this. Evil is not about a complexion of the skin or one's ancestral background. It's about the condition of the human heart. Because I guarantee for most of you, when I said the most prolific serial killer in the history of our country was a black man, you probably thought, because, no. You think of John Wayne Gacy or Dahmer or whoever. But the most prolific serial killer in the history of our country is a black man. See, a racial worldview is a lying worldview because it tries to tell you that something that is essentially superficial, namely the complexion of one's skin, is somehow the defining characteristic of a person. Their character and a predictor of their destiny, because of course their destiny, if they're dark skinned, is not in their own hands and in the hands of God. Their destiny is in the hands of these other people, their oppressors, which is another lie. Again, it's very similar to the lie that Hitler told the German people. If we want to have our own destiny as Germans, we must kill all the Jews. They're in the way. They're the problem. We're all their virtuous victims, and they're all our oppressive villains. It's the same ideological perspective. Now, let me add one other thing, and then I want to talk a little bit about what I talked about at the Martin Luther King Leadership Breakfast. The problem with that perspective is, and there are many problems, but another problem, I should say, with that perspective is that it robs people of personal agency. It robs people of the right to determine their own destiny, because it says to them, your destiny is not in your hands, it's in the hands of those other people. And they don't like you, and they're against you, and they're going to stop you. Well, it's a lie. It's just a lie out of the pit of hell. You say, well, what about the history of the country? Yes, of course, the history of the country, and it's real. But I've also pointed out that the history of the world is no different. You go to countries now and you will have differences between Indonesians of different backgrounds. Sometimes I think it's the Indonesians where a lot of Malaysians have come in and they are clashing with one another. It's just the way life is in a sin, sick, and fallen world. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with the pigment of one's skin. But if you buy into that worldview, if I'd bought into that, I'd have never written a book. Why? Well, they won't let me. I'd have not gone to Harvard Law School. Why? Because they won't let me in. Because I told you, I had professors who told me that I wasn't going to get into Harvard Law School because they said, black people don't do well on standardized tests because they're culturally biased. And my first thought was, well, my ancestors have been here 200 years. I mean, I think I've got the culture. I was going to say, I'm an American. What do you mean the culture is culturally biased? What do you mean? Like, we all live in houses or apartments. We all drive cars. We all wear clothes. I mean, what does that even mean? What it often means is simply an excuse for the fact that children in some backgrounds are not being exposed to the books and the experiences. And by the way, this has nothing to do with money. Doesn't cost you anything to go to a library. Often not being exposed to the things that maybe children from a more affluent background are exposed to. You know, studies have shown that children from educated parents have twice as many vocabulary words spoken to them in the course of a day as children from uneducated parents. And I don't think that has a whole lot to do with education. I think that has to do with the initiative of the parents. My children were reading at the earliest possible moment. In fact, my granddaughter can read letters now. She won't be 2 years old until March, but she can read letters now. And when I'm spending time with her, we make letters together, and as she points out letters to me and she counts, and I sing her the alphabet, and we read books together. She'll hand me a book that she wants me to read. You don't have to be rich to do that. You just have to understand the value of education. Now, that's what cultural bias is all about. That's not the purview of quote-unquote white people. That's just the purview of people who are interested enough in their children to want to expose them to things that will help them to develop intellectually. See, but that puts the onus on you, doesn't it? On the parent. Rather than, well, you know, black people can't, and black people aren't, and white people won't. And I mean, all of this nonsense that avoids taking responsibility for your own life and for what you want to achieve in life. So basically, it short circuits talent. I told you all, I spoke to, and you may not have heard this before, but this is an experience, not that I read in a book. I actually had this experience. I was talking to a group of young guys when I was up in Boston. We had a lot of gang warfare going on and a lot of just craziness in the streets. And we had a very vibrant youth program there. And we were talking to all these young people, girls and boys. We had them in separate groups. And I was talking to a group of young guys right out of the heart of the inner city. And we started talking about drugs and gangs and all this. And I would start to minister to them about how self-destructive and suicidal this stuff was. And I will never forget it. And here's what they said to me. Well, we can't do anything else because the white man won't let us. Folks, literally, that's what they said. And they all sort of nodded in agreement, like that was the truth. And, you know, I put the question to them. I'll never forget the incident. I said, so explain to me how that works. So the teacher gives you homework. What, does a white man steal your books on the way home? Does he come home with you and hide your books or lock them away or tell you you can't study? I mean, explain to me how he won't let you. And of course, they looked at me like I had two heads because they never really thought through it. This is just rhetoric that they're hearing from this idiot Al Sharpton and all these race hustlers. That's what they're hearing from them. And it's great because it absolves me of responsibility. I don't have to do anything because after all, I'm a victim and I can't do anything. So sure, I'm going to end up in jail. Sure, I'm going to end up dead in the streets early on. But that's because of what white people are doing. Not because of any choices I make, because I don't get to make any choices. It robs people of human agency. It robs them of the ability to control their own destiny. Here's the other thing I want to say, this is what I alluded to yesterday, and I think this is what prompted one relative of a church member to say they want to talk to me. Because, folks, we've got, at last count, and I think there's more by now, but since the Defund the Police movement began, since the Dismantle the Police movement began, since the Black Lives Matter movement arose in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, the tragic, unfortunate death of George Floyd, when all the riots started and all the craziness started, we got to reimagine the police and all that started, and police departments became underfunded, understaffed, demoralized because they were constantly attacked for being racist and so forth. We have lost 577 black children in the streets of our cities, predominantly black. It might be 3 or 4 that are not black, predominantly black, a few Hispanics, in the streets of our cities around this country. 577. We're approaching 600 children. And I'm not talking about gangbangers. I'm not talking about teenagers out 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning shooting off guns and fighting. I'm talking about innocent kids. The earliest one is 1 month old, but it goes all the way up to teenagers, minding their business, not doing anything wrong, and getting caught in the crossfire or getting gunned down because they have the wrong clothes on or whatever. Or get shot because somebody decided to shoot up their house because they thought they were trying to kill somebody else. They end up killing an innocent child. 577. And they're not killed by police. They're not killed by Ku Klux Klansmen. They're not killed by skinheads. They're not killed by white racists. They're being killed by the thugs that are roaming the streets because the police can't offer, the police ability to offer any real deterrence has been severely hampered since that whole thing started. And the primary victims of this violence and lawlessness and crime is black folks, and particularly black children. And the primary source of the problem, that what's creating the problem, because look, if you lived in a lawful, law-abiding community where people just really didn't believe in doing this stuff, it wouldn't matter, right? Because they wouldn't do it anyway. It's like crime in the black community was not at the epidemic proportions it is now. Before the great northern migration. That was not happening. And even after the great northern migration, that didn't start happening until the 60s. That you started to see crime increasing. And all these justifications, it's the criminal justice system, it's the social system, we need a great society program, we need this, we need that. But the reason why it wasn't happening prior to that was because the black family was largely intact. And overwhelmingly, by 1965, 75% of black children were born in two-parent monogamous families. In 1950, it was about 87%. I think the Great Migration, Northern migration, I think undermined the family a little bit because it created a greater sense of anonymity. And of course, it brought sort of the urban flavor into the lives of people who had been living primarily rural lives, where the church was the center of cultural life. And everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew what everybody was doing. It's not that people didn't commit sin then. Of course, they still did. But there were, put it this way, there was a lot more disincentive to sin, okay? Because Aunt Mabel down the road saw you, and Uncle Fred across the street saw you, and Grandmama saw you, and and everybody's watching everybody else. And the church is really where everybody goes to get their sense of cultural belonging. And of course, people are at least preaching the word of God, preaching some semblance of righteousness, that this is right and this is wrong. So you had, let's put it this way, you had more cultural support for doing what is right and trying to make something of yourself. That's why even in the worst of conditions, how in the world, in the worst of conditions, did we produce a Frederick Douglass? Did we produce a George Washington Carver? Did we produce a Booker T. Washington? How in the world, in the worst of conditions, did these things happen? They happened because there were cultural forces, and by the way, primarily Christian cultural forces, pushing people to do well, pushing people to achieve. And then you get into the 60s, and no. Your achievement is not your responsibility. That's the system's responsibility. That's the white man's responsibility. That's somebody else's responsibility. And you're not achieving, that's because somebody else is stopping you. When my teachers told me that when I was graduating from college, that I probably could not get into Harvard Law School or any Ivy League school because I was black and black people didn't do well on the LSATs, you know what my immediate response was? Well, then I'll just show you. And I went to the library and started looking up whatever information they had about the LSATs because I wanted to understand them. And I found out I could go to the library. I didn't have money to pay for any of this training, but I went to the library and they had practice exams that you could take. And I don't know how long before I took the LSATs, but I did practice exam after practice exam on my own. I timed myself and then scored myself. By the time I walked to the LSAT, I was entirely comfortable because I knew exactly what I was facing. I'd practice it over and over and over and over and over again. Now, I could have sat back and said, well, you know what, I'm not going to apply to Harvard. By the way, I got into every law school I applied to. I didn't get turned down by not one. I was put on the waiting list for Yale, but ultimately got into Yale as well. So I got into Yale, Columbia, Michigan, University of Virginia, every school I applied to. I've kept the letters. The one who was told, don't apply to schools like that because they're not going to let you in because you're black. And black people, not because they want to discriminate against me because I was black, but because black people are handicapped intellectually, you see. The tests are biased against them. I was told the same thing about the bar exam. Well, you know, black people don't pass the bar exam the first time because, you know, it's not geared for us. Oh, please. I mean, the law is the law, right? I passed 2 bar exams. Same sitting. I flew to Philadelphia, took the Pennsylvania bar exam, flew back to Massachusetts the next day, took the Massachusetts bar exam, and then the 3rd day took they had a multi-state, you had 2 essay exams. You had an essay exam for the state, then you had a multiple choice exam for federal law. I took all at the same sitting, passed both exams. I passed the bar exam for Pennsylvania, passed the bar exam for Massachusetts. I'm not bragging on me. I'm just saying that instead of listening to people telling me what you can't do because you're black, I just went on and did it. Now, look, Thomas Sowell has done a lot of writing on this, and I really wish that every student in America would read his writings, because Thomas Sowell talks about the fact that it is not race that is the primary determinant of an individual's success or a group's of people's success, it is culture. The norms, the values, the beliefs, the ideas, the behaviors that people adopt are greater predictors of what those people are going to accomplish than anything else. I mean, why do you think, I forget what the number is, but Jews are like, I guess about 1% of the world population. I think they're only 2 or 3% of the American population. I think they've got something like 20-some% of the Nobel Prizes for things like math and science. Why? It's not because they're genetically superior to anybody else. I really do believe the blessing of God rests on them, but it's also because they have a culture that promotes intellectual development. I mean, that's very different than a culture in which kids are told, if you're trying to speak proper English, you're acting white. What? I said yesterday, that's like going to Africa and telling people that if you try to speak proper Swahili, you're acting African. I mean, it's stupid. But that's what you get when you have a racial worldview. Everything is tinged by it. Everything is poisoned by it. Everything is shaded by it. And you know what? Its primary victim is the person who holds that view, because that view will hold them back. And ultimately, taken to its logical extreme, it will destroy them. Because instead of focusing on themselves and their own development and their own advancement, their own progress, they're busy focused on other people and what they're doing. I've said many times, instead of obsessing about what others have done to you, real or imagined, we need to be obsessing about what God wants to do through you. Why does God have me here? Why in this particular place? Why at this particular time? I talked about the fact that yesterday, it is the breakdown of the family more than race that is causing the havoc that we are seeing in the inner cities of our country. I mean, because I grew up in the inner city. Why? And I was on my way to becoming a part of that when I was in foster care. But what changed? My father changed the trajectory of my life by simply saying, this is what you may do and this is what you may not do. This is the way you will talk and this is the way you will not talk. This is how you behave. And this is you will do your homework. You will study. You will do well in school. It's not an option. And you will not hang out with people who are committing crimes. You will not get involved with gangs. You will not, it's not acceptable. And if I have any indication that that's the way you're heading, you will pay the consequences with me. It was very clear. As opposed to, well, son, if you get out there and you rob somebody, you hurt somebody, I understand it because after all, you're an oppressed black man. I mean, that stuff is suicidal. And they've now spun it into a whole industry. Of course, it's been an industry for a long time, but a whole industry, a whole psychological industry, all the trauma of being black. I mean, give me a break. You hear these stupid politicians say, I wake up every morning wondering whether I'm going to be stopped for driving while black. Oh, Lord. And the only thing I wonder whether I'm going to be stopped for is for driving while speeding. You know? And I've had my share of those encounters. Look, when we stand before God, and every Christian needs to hear me well, and all these black pastors who are teaching this racial garbage to their congregations are going to have to answer to God. Of course, some of them are going to go to hell anyway, because some of them don't know God anyway. They don't know Jesus. They're race men. They're not Christians. They're not proclaimers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They're racial people. They're proclaimers of the good news of racial solidarity. Yeah, there's not really any racial solidarity in heaven. The solidarity is going to be around Jesus and him alone. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. It's not built on my race. It's not built on my degrees. It's not built on my money. It's not built on my notoriety or fame or power or influence or who I know in this earthly realm. It's built on Jesus' blood and his righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name, on Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. Martin Luther King, I think, believed that. I don't know whether he would have held fast because there were a lot of leftist pressures on him. But I shared yesterday, and I'll end with this. Shared yesterday one of the quotes that I said that very few people will hear from Dr. King, but it's a quote about individual liberty and personal responsibility. He was speaking to a group of students at Barrett Junior High School in Philadelphia on October 26, 1967, when the black family, by the way, was largely intact. And here's what he said to them. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets like Leontine Price sings before the Metropolitan Opera. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. Doors are opening to you, he said. Doors of opportunity that were not open to your mothers and fathers. And the great challenge facing you is to be ready to face these doors as they open. Don't just set out to do a good job. Set out to do such a good job that the living, the dead, or the unborn couldn't do it any better. Set out to do it as if God Almighty called you at this particular moment in history to do it. And then he closed with the words of Douglas Mallock's famous poem, be the best of whatever you are. If you can't be a pine at the top of the hill, be a shrub in the valley, but be the best little shrub on the side of a hill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be a sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or fail. Be the best of whatever you are. The future of our country lies in our being a colorblind meritocracy that only cares about people's competence and character and nothing else. And I think that's in keeping with a biblical worldview, because, you know, there is no affirmative action for heaven. There's no special entree for quote unquote people of color. All have got to come the same way. Sinners in need of salvation. All need the grace of God. By grace are you saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, lest any man should boast. And I don't see any racial exceptions in there. Do you? Well, listen, I pray that Dr. King's true legacy will be embraced, and all of this counterfeit nonsense by the so-called civil rights establishment will be completely rejected, including embracing all this homosexuality, transgender, gender confusion, LGBTQ, SPCG, sexual perversion, child grooming garbage that has now sort of been grafted on to the civil rights movement. And you can barely hear black without hearing so-called gay. Black and gay, black and gay. I mean, and they've mostly adopted this nonsense. We as Christians have got to stand for a biblical worldview. And I believe when Dr. King said he dreamed of the day when his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, that is the byword for our country, and that's the way our country functions, because that will unify us. And what we're being sold today is calculated to do nothing but divide us. Well, I've got to go. I'm a little bit over, but God bless each and every one of you. So stand up, step up, speak up, refuse to back up, because we cannot be defeated if we will not quit, because we are on God's side.